There is a photograph taken in the spring of 1997. Carolyn Bessette-Kennedy is leaving a building in Manhattan. She is always leaving a building in these photographs, and she is wearing something simple and dark, and her face is turned just slightly away from the camera. Not far enough to suggest she hasn't seen it. Far enough to suggest she has decided not to acknowledge it. She is 29 years old. She has been married to the most scrutinized bachelor in America for less than a year. She is, by every visible measurement, at the apex of a life that millions of women have been told to want. And yet something in that image sits wrong. It is not grief, exactly. It is not fear. It is the expression of someone who has become very skilled at being present without arriving. A woman who has learned through practice rather than instinct how to stand inside her own life as though she is observing it from a slight distance. This is not a story about a plane crash. It is not a story about a famous husband, or a fairy tale wedding, or a family name that swallowed everything it touched. It is a story about the years before all of that, and the years between, and the specific, quiet cost of becoming an image rather than a person, of what it does to someone to be seen constantly and known barely at all. The crash comes at the end. What led to it is longer and slower, and in many ways stranger than the tragedy itself. We begin in a house in White Plains, New York, where a girl is already learning that the most important thing is how things appear. White Plains, New York, in the 1970s is not wealthy. It is the kind of place that exists in careful proximity to wealth. Close enough to see it, far enough to feel the distance as a daily fact. The houses are respectable. The lawns are maintained. The children are dressed well enough that no one asks uncomfortable questions. It is a suburb that has learned to perform a version of stability it does not entirely possess, and it is, in this way, a precise environment in which to raise Carolyn Bessette. She is born in January 1966, the third daughter of William Bessette and Anne-Marie Messina. The household is not unhappy in any dramatic sense. It is simply a household organized around the management of appearances, which is its own kind of pressure, particularly for a child who is, from an early age, unusually beautiful in a way that other people feel entitled to comment on. Her parents divorce when Carolyn is still young. This detail appears in almost every account of her life and is usually treated as background, a piece of context before the real story begins. But divorce in a Catholic family in White Plains in the early 1970s is not background. It is a rupture that requires explanation, and when explanation is unavailable, it requires silence. Carolyn grows up in a house where something significant has happened and is not discussed, which is its own education. She learns early that the maintenance of a composed surface is not vanity. It is survival. Her mother, Anne-Marie, remarries. The second husband is Richard Freeman, a prominent orthopedic surgeon in New York. The family moves to Greenwich, Connecticut, a different category of place entirely. Greenwich in the late 1970s is old money, manicured, and quietly ruthless in the way that genuinely wealthy communities always are toward those who arrive, rather than belong. The Freeman household is comfortable, more than comfortable. But Carolyn does not arrive in Greenwich as someone who belongs there. She arrives as a daughter of the new husband, which is a specific social position with specific social consequences. At Greenwich High School, Carolyn is remembered by classmates as magnetic but guarded. She is popular in the sense that people want to be near her. But she does not, by most accounts, let many people past a certain point. She is funny and warm in groups, and then suddenly, quietly, unavailable. Friends describe the sensation of feeling close to her, and then realizing they don't know her particularly well. She is present in photographs from this period. School events, group pictures, always composed, always slightly apart even when surrounded by people. She is also, by her own later account and those of people who knew her then, intensely aware of the social architecture of Greenwich in a way that a child raised there from birth might not be. She can see the system because she entered it from outside. She knows which families have the kind of money that doesn't need to announce itself, and she knows that her own position in the Freeman household, however comfortable, is not quite the same thing. This awareness does not make her bitter. It makes her watchful. There is a particular kind of intelligence that develops in people who grow up adjacent to wealth without being fully inside it. An ability to read rooms, to calibrate behavior, to understand what is wanted and supply it before the wanting is made explicit. Carolyn develops this intelligence early, and she develops it well. It will serve her for years. It will also cost her considerably. What she wants in any interior sense is difficult to locate in the historical record, which is itself telling. The people who knew her in high school speak about how she made them feel rather than what she expressed. She made people feel seen. She made people feel that they were the most interesting person in the room. She had, even then, a talent for attention that was also, if you looked at it from a certain angle, a talent for deflection. She was so good at focusing outward that the question of what was happening inward rarely came up. She attends St. Michael's College in Vermont for a brief period before transferring to Boston University. And it is in this transition that something clarifies. St. Michael's is small, Catholic, contained. Boston University is urban, image-conscious, and socially stratified in a way that rewards exactly the skills Carolyn has spent her adolescence refining. She arrives there in the mid-1980s, studies education, and begins to inhabit a version of herself that is polished, deliberate, and almost entirely controlled. Her roommates and classmates at Boston University describe someone who was meticulous about her appearance without seeming to try, which is the highest level of effort, disguised as effortlessness. She knew clothes, not in a frivolous sense, but in the way that someone knows a language they have studied rather than inherited. She understood what fabric and cut and color communicated about a person, and she used that understanding with precision. This was not superficiality. It was a form of literacy that she had worked to acquire because she understood, from direct experience, that in the environments she was moving through, how you looked was not separate from who you were considered to be. She graduates in 1988. The career she pursues is not teaching, which was nominally her field of study, but fashion. Specifically the retail floor of Calvin Klein in Boston, where she begins as a sales associate and where she is almost immediately noticed for the same quality she has been cultivating since Greenwich, the ability to make people feel that they are in the presence of someone who understands them. She sells clothes the way certain people play music, with a kind of fluency that suggests the skill is natural, even when it isn't. Her mother's remarriage gave her proximity to a world with different rules than the one she was born into. Her parents' divorce taught her that composed surfaces are maintained by choice, not circumstance. By the time she leaves Boston University and walks onto the floor of a Calvin Klein boutique, Carolyn Bessette is already someone who has spent 22 years learning how to be looked at without being seen. She is very good at it. She will get better, and the world she is about to enter will reward her for it in ways that have nothing to do with her and everything to do with the image she has learned to project. The Calvin Klein boutique on Boylston Street in Boston in the late 1980s is a particular kind of environment. It is spare, controlled, and deliberately intimidating in the way that high-end retail always is. The emptiness of the floor, the precision of the lighting, the clothes hung with enough space between them to suggest that abundance itself is a form of vulgarity. Everything in the store communicates a single idea, that taste is not something you are born with, but it can be purchased if you know what you are doing. Carolyn Bessette knows what she is doing. She arrives on that floor in 1988 and is, within a short period, one of its most effective salespeople. This is not merely a matter of beauty, though beauty is part of it. The customers who walk into a Calvin Klein boutique in Boston are not there because they need clothing. They are there because they want to feel a certain way. Refined, modern, above the noise of ordinary life. And Carolyn has an instinct for identifying exactly what version of themselves a person is trying to become. She sells toward that vision rather than toward the garment. It is a subtle distinction, but it is the difference between a transaction and an experience, and it is why people ask for her by name. She is promoted, then promoted again. By the early 1990s, she has moved to New York, to the Calvin Klein headquarters on 7th Avenue, into a role that is less retail and more relationship management, working with celebrities, stylists, editors, and the specific category of very wealthy private client who requires not just clothing, but handling. She is, by her late 20s, operating at the center of an industry entirely organized around the manufacturing of desire, and she is fluent in its language in a way that takes most people years to acquire, if they acquire it at all. New York in the early 1990s is a specific cultural moment. The excess of the 1980s has curdled slightly. There is AIDS, there is recession, there is a new kind of self-consciousness about conspicuous consumption. But the fashion industry has metabolized all of it and continues to produce, with remarkable efficiency, new versions of aspiration. Calvin Klein is particularly good at this. His aesthetic in this period is minimalist in a way that feels almost puritanical, which is itself a kind of luxury. The idea that you have moved beyond decoration into something purer, something essential. Carolyn inhabits this aesthetic completely. She dresses in clean lines and neutral colors. She wears her blonde hair pulled back or loose in a way that looks unconsidered and is entirely considered. Her colleagues from this period describe a woman who was exceptionally competent and exceptionally private. She was warm in the way that very controlled people can be warm. Present, attentive, genuinely funny. But she maintained, even in an office environment, a quality of personal inaccessibility that her colleagues learned not to push against. She did not discuss her family in any detail. She did not discuss her romantic life unless she chose to. And she rarely chose to. What she discussed was work, and she discussed it with a focus that her supervisors found impressive and her peers found occasionally unnerving. She is, during these years, conducting a kind of ongoing education in what it means to be a woman in a particular stratum of New York society. The fashion industry is not simply a commercial enterprise. It is a social system with its own hierarchies, its own codes, and its own very specific expectations about femininity. What it should look like, how it should behave, what it is permitted to want. Carolyn moves through this system with apparent ease, but the ease is learned, and what she is learning has a cost that does not become visible for several more years. The clients she works with are, in many cases, famous. She dresses actresses for award ceremonies, manages the requests of socialites, navigates the particular delicacy of telling a very wealthy woman that a garment does not serve her. She does all of this with a tact that is, by multiple accounts, remarkable. The ability to deliver unwelcome information in a way that leaves the recipient feeling cared for rather than corrected. This skill, which seems professional on its surface, is in fact deeply personal. It is the same skill she developed in Greenwich, refined in Boston, and is now applying at the highest level of a world that runs on managed perception. What is harder to locate in the accounts of people who worked with her during this period is evidence of what she thought about any of it. She was not, by reputation, cynical. She was not dismissive of the work or contemptuous of the clients. But there is a consistent quality in how her colleagues describe her that suggests a woman who was engaged with her environment without being absorbed by it. Someone doing the work very well while also watching it from a slight remove. Whether this distance was protective or simply temperamental is not clear. Possibly it was both. She meets John F. Kennedy Jr. sometime around 1992 or 1993. The exact circumstances are disputed in the way that romantic origins often are when both people involved become public property. What is known is that he is a regular presence in the Calvin Klein world. He is, in this period, widely considered the most eligible bachelor in the country, a fact that has been reported so many times it has become something closer to a civic designation than a description, and that Carolyn, by virtue of her role, moves in the same orbit. What is also known is that she does not, by any account, pursue him. This detail is significant not because it reflects particular virtue, but because it reflects something consistent with everything else she has done since Greenwich. She understands instinctively that being wanted is more powerful than wanting, and she has trained herself over many years to operate from that position. She is 26 or 27 years old. She is at the peak of what the industry she works in values. And she is, without quite intending to, about to become something considerably more complicated than a very good saleswoman at the most image-conscious fashion house in America. The man who will define her public life is moving toward her. She does not move toward him. She simply remains where she is and composed, contained, and entirely visible, and waits. There is a particular moment that several of Carolyn's colleagues from the Calvin Klein years return to when they describe what she was like at work. A celebrity, the name varies depending on who is telling the story, arrives for a fitting in a state of barely managed anxiety. The fitting is for a significant public appearance. The stakes, in the way that fashion stakes always are simultaneously enormous and entirely artificial. The celebrity is difficult. She changes her mind repeatedly, dismisses options that took days to prepare, and at one point says something cutting to a junior member of the team. Carolyn does not react. She redirects. She asks a question that has nothing to do with the clothes. Something personal, something that suggests she has been paying attention to this woman's life in a way that goes beyond the professional. And within a few minutes, the energy in the room has shifted. The fitting concludes. The celebrity leaves satisfied. The junior staff member is quietly checked on afterward. This story, in the way it is usually told, is meant to illustrate Carolyn's warmth. What it also illustrates, if you look at it from a different angle, is the degree to which her professional role required her to absorb other people's anxiety and return it to them as calm. She was, in functional terms, an emotional regulator for people who had more power than she did and less self-possession. She was very good at this, and the industry rewarded her for it in the way industries always reward people who make powerful people feel better about themselves. With access, with proximity, with a kind of social elevation that looks from the outside like success. By the early 1990s, Carolyn is working directly with Calvin Klein himself, which is a different category of professional relationship than managing celebrity clients. Klein is, in this period, one of the most powerful figures in American fashion, a man who has built an empire on a very specific idea of beauty and who has an instinct for identifying people who embody that idea and drawing them close. He notices Carolyn not simply because she is beautiful, though she is, but because she has the quality his aesthetic requires. She looks as though she is not trying. She wears the clothes as though they belong to her naturally, which is the highest possible endorsement in an industry built on the premise that identity can be purchased. She becomes, in a role that is never quite formally defined, something between a muse and a lieutenant. She is involved in decisions about how the brand presents itself, which clients are cultivated, which relationships are managed. She has opinions about the clothes and is permitted to express them, which is a form of trust that is not extended to everyone in the organization. She travels. She attends shows. She sits in rooms where the people around her are famous and powerful and treats all of it with a composure that her colleagues find either impressive or unnerving, depending on their relationship to her. What the Calvin Klein years give Carolyn, beyond professional competence, is a very thorough education in the machinery of image production. She watches from close range how a brand decides what it wants to be and then constructs every surface of its public existence to communicate that decision. She watches how people are used in this process, how a face or a body or a name becomes an instrument of a larger message, and what happens to the person behind the face when the message shifts and a new instrument is required. She watches Klein himself, who is brilliant at this and who moves through the world with the specific confidence of someone who has decided that the image and the person are the same thing. Whether she finds this convincing is not recorded. What is recorded in the accounts of people around her is that she begins during these years to develop a very precise understanding of the difference between being valued and being used, and that the line between the two in the fashion world is rarely as clear as it should be. There's also the question of what the work costs her personally, which is harder to document but worth attending to. She is, throughout her time at Calvin Klein, managing an enormous amount of other people's emotional labor. The clients, the celebrities, the internal politics of a high-pressure creative organization, while maintaining, as she always has, a surface that gives very little away. Her social life in New York during this period is active. She has friends, she goes out, she is present in the kind of gatherings that the fashion and media worlds organize with such regularity that attendance begins to feel like a professional obligation. But the people she is closest to during these years describe someone who needs, with increasing frequency, to disappear, to go home, to be alone, to decompress in a way that suggests the performance of composure is more effortful than it appears. She also, during this period, has a relationship with JFK Jr. that has moved beyond the professional and into something more complicated. They are together, then not together, then together again, in a cycle that several people close to both of them describe as exhausting to observe. He is compelling and charismatic, and entirely accustomed to being the most important person in any room, which is a quality that Carolyn, given her professional experience, recognizes and navigates with some skill. But navigating it is not the same as being unaffected by it, and their relationship, even in these early years, has a quality of instability that the people around them note and that neither of them seems able or willing to resolve. What the Calvin Klein years ultimately produce is a woman who is extraordinarily skilled at managing perception, her own, other people's, the space between them, and who is paid for that skill with a progressive narrowing of the distance between the performance and the self. She has spent the better part of a decade in an industry that treats the surface as the substance, and something of that industry's logic has settled into her. Not cynically, not consciously, but in the way that prolonged exposure to any environment eventually shapes the people inside it, whether they intend it or not. She is, by the mid-1990s, one of the most visually recognized women in New York, without being known, in any meaningful sense, at all. The relationship between Carolyn Bessette and John F. Kennedy Jr. does not begin cleanly. There is no single moment that both parties later agree on, no dinner or introduction that gets recorded in the way that origin stories usually do when the people involved become famous enough for their origins to matter. What there is instead is a period of overlap, professional, social, physical, that gradually acquires weight and then becomes, without quite being declared, something that other people start to arrange themselves around. John is, in the early 1990s, exactly what the culture has made him. He is 31, 32 years old, the son of an assassinated president, and a woman who became, in her widowhood, one of the most mythologized figures of the 20th century. He has grown up inside a level of public scrutiny that has no real precedent. Photographed since infancy, mourned over collectively, treated by an entire country as a kind of living symbol of something it lost and cannot stop grieving. He is also, by the accounts of everyone who knew him personally, genuinely charming, physically striking, and possessed of a warmth that is not performed. He is not a simple man pretending to be complicated. He is a complicated man who has learned, out of necessity, to appear uncomplicated. He has also, by this point, a well-documented history with women, a series of significant relationships that have each, in their own way, foundered against the specific difficulties of being close to someone whose public existence is so enormous that it crowds out the private one. His former girlfriends, in the accounts they have given over the years, describe a man who was loving and attentive, and also somehow always slightly elsewhere. Present in the room and absent in some harder-to-name way, as though a portion of him had always already been redirected toward something larger than the person in front of him. Carolyn, when she enters his orbit more fully, is not naive about any of this. She is working in an industry that has watched John Kennedy for years with the particular attention that fashion and media give to people who are both powerful and beautiful, and she has access to the accumulated intelligence of that watching. She knows his history. She knows what being with him will mean in terms of public exposure. She is not, by the accounts of people close to her, someone who pursues the relationship for the access or the visibility it will bring. But she is also not someone who fails to understand what she is moving toward. They begin spending time together in a way that is initially ambiguous. The category of closeness that exists before either party is willing to name it. They are seen at events. They are seen leaving events. The tabloids, which have tracked John with the dedication of a long-term surveillance operation, begin to notice Carolyn and to photograph her with the slightly predatory attention that falls on anyone who moves into his proximity. She handles this in the early period with the composure that has by now become her primary mode of existing in the world. She does not acknowledge the cameras. She does not perform for them. She looks in the photographs from this period like someone who is choosing very deliberately not to be available. What is happening between them privately is more difficult to reconstruct. The people who are close to both of them describe a relationship that is, from its earliest stages, characterized by intensity rather than ease. They fight, not occasionally in the way that most couples fight, but with a regularity and a ferocity that the people around them find alarming. The arguments are about specific things: his lateness, his other friendships, the question of what their life together is supposed to look like. But underneath the specific things is a more fundamental tension that no one quite articulates directly. Two people who are each, in their own way, accustomed to controlling the terms of their relationships, discovering that the other person will not be controlled. John's mother, Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, dies in May 1994. This event is significant not simply as a personal loss, though it is clearly that, and devastating, but because it removes from John's life the one person who had, by all accounts, served as both anchor and compass. Jackie had opinions about how John should live, who he should be with, what he should do with his name and his position, and those opinions, even when they created friction, provided a structure. After her death, that structure is gone, and John is, at 33 years old, with his mother's estate and his family's mythology and his own uncertain ambitions all pressing on him simultaneously, more unmoored than he has ever been. It is in this period of unmooring that the relationship with Carolyn becomes more serious. Whether this is cause or coincidence is not entirely clear. What is clear is that by 1995, they are living together in John's Tribeca loft, which is itself a statement of seriousness in the way that New York cohabitation always is, and that the relationship has acquired, for both of them, a weight that makes it harder to exit than either might have anticipated. The loft on North Moore Street is photographed repeatedly from outside. The building's lobby, its entrance, the sidewalk in front of it. All of these become locations that the tabloid press monitors with the attention usually reserved for government buildings or crime scenes. Carolyn, leaving for work in the morning or returning in the evening, becomes a recurring figure in the city's visual landscape. She's always composed. She's always moving. She almost never stops. Inside the apartment, by the accounts of the friends who visited, there is evidence of two people building something that neither of them knows how to build. They have strong opinions about furniture, about food, about how the space should feel. They cook together. They have people over. There are stretches of what sounds, in retrospect, like genuine happiness. There are also arguments that leave people shaken, and silences afterward that last longer than they should, and a recurring pattern in which the relationship seems to stabilize and then, under the pressure of some external event, destabilizes again. By 1996, they have been together in this uneven way for approximately 3 years. John has begun to talk in private about marriage. Carolyn's response to this, in the accounts of people she confides in, is not simple joy. It is something more complicated, a recognition that saying yes means accepting not just John, but everything that comes with him, all of it, permanently, in public, for the rest of her life. She says yes. The wedding is planned in secret, and the secrecy itself, which will feel romantic in the telling, is the first indication of what the marriage will actually require of her. Cumberland Island is a barrier island off the coast of Georgia, 18 miles long, accessible only by ferry, with no paved roads and a population that fluctuates between a handful of permanent residents and the occasional visiting family with enough money and connections to arrange access. It is not a place you stumble upon. It is a place you choose deliberately, which means it is a place that communicates something about the people who choose it. In September 1996, John F. Kennedy Jr. and Carolyn Bessette are married there in a ceremony so carefully controlled that even some of their closest friends do not know it is happening until it has already happened. The location is, on its surface, romantic. The First African Baptist Church, where the ceremony takes place, is a small wooden structure built by freed slaves in the 1890s, spare, candlelit, surrounded by moss-draped oaks. The photographs that eventually emerge show something that looks, in purely visual terms, like an intimate and deliberately understated event. Carolyn's dress, designed by Narciso Rodriguez, is bias-cut silk crepe in ivory, minimal, architectural, and so precisely calibrated to her particular kind of beauty that it will be discussed and reproduced for decades. John is in a dark suit, They look, in the photographs, like two people who have found a way to be private in public, which is exactly the illusion the occasion is designed to produce. What the photographs do not show is the machinery required to produce them. The guest list is approximately 40 people, which is not intimate by any ordinary standard, but is, by Kennedy standard, almost comically small. The selection of those 40 people is itself a document of priorities. John's sister Caroline is there. His Kennedy cousins are present in limited number. The composition of the list reflects, with precision, a set of decisions about who belongs to this marriage and who does not, and those decisions will have consequences that extend well beyond the wedding day. Carolyn's family is present, but their presence is complicated. Her mother, Anne-Marie, is there, her sisters are there. But the Bessette family is not the Kennedy family, and this fact, obvious, structural, never directly stated, shapes the entire event. The wedding is held on an island that the Kennedy family has a long association with, in a building with historical significance to American history, in a ceremony that has been shaped by what John's family requires, rather than what either family together might have chosen. The Bessettes are guests at a Kennedy event. This is not a merger. It is an absorption. The secrecy surrounding the wedding is presented in most accounts as a romantic gesture, a refusal to let the media turn a private moment into a public spectacle. And there is truth in this. John has spent his entire life being photographed at moments that should have been private, and his desire to protect this particular moment from that intrusion is understandable. But the secrecy also serves another function, which is control. By keeping the wedding hidden until it is over, John and the Kennedy operation that surrounds him, the lawyers and advisors and family members who have always understood that the Kennedy name is a brand as much as it is a bloodline, ensures that the narrative of the marriage is released on their terms, with their images, at a moment of their choosing. The photographs are released through the press the following morning, and the response is immediate and enormous. The images of Carolyn in the Rodriguez dress circulate globally within hours. She is, in a single day, transformed from a woman who has spent years managing other people's images into the most photographed woman in America. The Calvin Klein employee who understood the machinery of image production has become the product. The transition is complete before she has had time to think carefully about what it means. What is also notable about the wedding, and in what becomes clearer in retrospect, is what it establishes about the terms of the marriage itself. The location was John's choice, or the Kennedy family's choice, or some combination of the two that is functionally the same thing. The guest list was negotiated around John's world. The secrecy protected John's interests, as well as Carolyn's, but the Kennedy family's interests most of all. Carolyn is, from the first day of her marriage, operating inside a set of conditions she did not design and cannot easily renegotiate. The honeymoon is brief. They return to New York quickly, which is itself a signal. John has a magazine to run, George, the political culture publication he founded in 1995, and the operational demands of his life do not pause for a honeymoon. Carolyn returns to a city that now knows her face in a different way. The photographers outside the Northmore Street loft are more numerous than before. The attention is of a different quality, more intense, more proprietary, as though the public, having witnessed the wedding photographs, now feels a certain ownership over what comes next. She handles the first weeks after the wedding with the same composure she has always produced. She is photographed leaving the apartment. She is photographed running errands. She is photographed in ways that have nothing to do with her choices or actions, and everything to do with her new last name. The images that emerge are almost uniformly striking. She photographs extremely well, on fire. There is something in her bearing, a quality of self-possession that the camera reads as confidence, and the press, in the immediate aftermath of the wedding, treats her with the combination of fascination and appetite that it reserves for beautiful women who have married powerful men. But beneath the composure, and visible to the people who know her well, is something that has shifted. A friend who sees her in the weeks after the wedding describes a woman who seems at once exactly the same and subtly altered, still warm, still funny, still entirely in control of her surface, but with something behind the control that is harder to read than before. Not unhappiness exactly. More like the expression of someone who has made a large and irreversible decision and is only now beginning to understand its full dimensions. The dress is already being copied by designers across the country. The name Bessette is already being dropped in favor of Kennedy. The woman who wore the dress and carried the name is already in the coverage, becoming secondary to the image she has produced. She has been married for 3 weeks. There is an apartment building on the corner of 5th Avenue and 85th Street in Manhattan that requires no introduction to anyone who has followed the Kennedy family with any seriousness. 1040 Fifth Avenue is where Jacqueline Kennedy moved after Dallas, after the White House, after the public period of mourning that the country conducted partly on her behalf and partly for its own needs. She lived there for 30 years until her death in 1994, and the apartment, 15 rooms overlooking Central Park, filled with objects that carried the specific gravity of a life lived at the center of American history, became, in that time, something more than a residence. It became a location in the mythology. John grew up moving between that apartment and the other coordinates of his mother's life. The Cape, the Vineyard, the Upper East Side social world that Jackie navigated with such practiced precision. He understood 1045th Avenue not as an address, but as a standard, a measure of what the Kennedy name properly maintained was supposed to look like. The rooms, the objects, the view, all of it communicated a set of expectations about how life at that level should be organized and presented. Carolyn does not move into 1045th Avenue. She and John live in the Tribeca loft on North Moore Street, which is John's space and has been for years. Younger, less formal, more reflective of who he is rather than who his family is. But the weight of 1045th Avenue does not require physical proximity to be felt. It operates as a reference point, a silent comparison against which the life Carolyn is now living is constantly, if quietly, measured. The Kennedy family into which Carolyn has married in the fall of 1996 is not the Kennedy family of popular imagination. The Camelot version, the frozen in amber version that exists in the photographs and the memorial volumes and the television documentaries. It is a living family with the specific complications that attend any large, wealthy, politically connected clan that has experienced multiple public tragedies and organized its collective identity around surviving them. There are cousins who have had serious legal troubles. There are family members who have struggled with addiction. There are old grievances and long memories and a set of unspoken rules about what is discussed inside the family and what is not, and what is owed to the name above all other considerations. Carolyn enters this family as John's wife, which is a position of nominal closeness and actual distance. She is not a Kennedy by blood, which in this family is a distinction that carries more weight than is ever directly stated. She has not come up through the system, the compound summers, the touch football games that function as loyalty tests, the particular way the family conducts itself in public that requires years of immersion to fully understand. She is an outsider who has married the most prominent insider, which means she is subject to a level of scrutiny from within the family that is, in some ways, more demanding than anything the press can produce. The women who have married into the Kennedy family before Carolyn have navigated this position with varying degrees of success and at varying personal cost. The template, such as it is, requires a specific kind of performance: warmth without presumption, presence without competition, support for the Kennedy man's public ambitions without drawing attention away from them. It is a supporting role, and it is expected to be played without complaint and without apparent effort, which is the most demanding kind of performance there is. Carolyn is not, by temperament or training, a supporting role person. She is someone who has spent her professional life being noticed, whose value in every room she has entered has been partly a function of her visibility, her presence, her ability to hold attention. The Kennedy family does not need her to hold attention. It needs her to redirect it. And this requirement, which is never spelled out because it doesn't need to be, settles over her life in the months after the wedding, like a change in atmospheric pressure, noticeable only in its effects. She does not attend all of the Kennedy family gatherings. This begins to be noted. She is seen less frequently at the Hyannisport compound, less frequently at the events that the Kennedy world organizes around itself, with the regularity of liturgical observance. When she is present, she is cordial and controlled and gives nothing away. When she is absent, her absence is discussed. John's relationship with his extended family is itself complicated. He is the center of the Kennedy mythology in a way that creates a kind of isolation, set apart even within the family, by the weight of what his father's death means to the country, and therefore to all of them. He loves his cousins and is exasperated by some of them. He is loyal to the family's public obligations and periodically resentful of what those obligations require. He is, in other words, a man with his own complicated relationship to the name he carries, and Carolyn has married not just him, but all of that. The loyalty and the resentment and the obligation and the mythology, all at once, permanently. The apartment on North Moore Street in this context becomes something more than a home. It becomes a refuge, the one space in their life that is not organized around the Kennedy name, that belongs to them rather than to the family or the public or the press. Carolyn invests in it with real attention. She thinks carefully about how it looks and feels. She is, by the accounts of people who visited, a precise and thoughtful host. The space reflects her taste as much as John's, which is itself a form of assertion in a life that is otherwise offering her decreasing room for assertion. But the apartment is also, increasingly, a place she does not leave easily, not because she is prevented from leaving. There's nothing so simple as a locked door, but because leaving means entering a city that has decided it owns her image, a press that treats her as public property, and a family world that measures her constantly against a standard it has never made explicit. She is 29 years old. She has been married less than a year. And the life she is living has already arranged itself with the quiet efficiency of systems that do not require anyone's conscious intention into a shape that leaves very little room for the person inside it. In the spring of 1997, a photographer stationed outside the North Moore Street loft captures Carolyn leaving the building at approximately 8 in the morning. She is wearing dark clothing, her hair loose, her face angled slightly downward in the way she has developed over the preceding months. Not a ducking away exactly, more a refusal to offer the full surface of herself to whatever lens happens to be present. The photograph is published. It is not a remarkable image by any objective standard. She is walking. She is alone. Nothing is happening. It runs anyway in a gossip column with a caption that describes her expression as troubled. She has not spoken. She has not stopped. She has simply walked out of her building in the morning, and the fact of her walking has been converted by the machinery that now surrounds her life into content. This is the texture of the paparazzi years. Not a single dramatic confrontation, but an accumulation of small intrusions that, taken individually, seem manageable, and taken together constitute a form of sustained pressure that has no clear endpoint and no formal remedy. By 1997, Carolyn Bessette-Kennedy is one of the most photographed women in America, which means she is one of the most watched, which means that the ordinary movements of her daily life, leaving buildings, entering cars, walking on sidewalks, buying coffee, have been reclassified without her consent as events. The photographers who cover her are not, for the most part, doing anything illegal. They are on public sidewalks. They are using equipment that is publicly available. They are responding to a market that has decided, with the specific authority that markets exercise, that images of Carolyn Bessette-Kennedy are worth money. The market is correct. The images sell. Magazines that run photographs of her on their covers see measurable increases in newsstand sales. The appetite is genuine and large and entirely indifferent to what it costs the person being photographed. What it costs her becomes visible gradually in the way that sustained pressure always reveals itself. Not in a single moment of collapse, but in a series of small adjustments that each seem reasonable in isolation. She begins varying her routes through the city, leaving the building at irregular times, using car services, rather than walking when walking would expose her to the cameras that wait outside. She begins wearing sunglasses in all weather. She begins, the people closest to her notice, to plan her movements through New York with the kind of tactical attention that is usually associated with people who have genuine security concerns, which she does, though the security concern is not physical danger, but the constant harvesting of her image without her participation. There is a specific incident in the spring of 1997 that receives significant attention. Carolyn and John are caught by photographers in a park near their apartment. What the photographers capture is a couple in conflict. They are arguing, visibly, and the argument has the quality of something that has been going on for some time and has not been resolved. The images are published. They are discussed. The argument, which is a private event between two people in a difficult marriage, becomes a media narrative with its own momentum, its own interpretations, its own subsequent coverage. People who know nothing about Carolyn or John or the specific pressures of their life together have opinions about what the photographs mean. Carolyn does not respond publicly. She does not comment. She maintains, as she always has, a surface that gives nothing away. But the incident marks something, not because it is the first time her private life has been made public. That conversion happened on the day of the wedding, arguably earlier, but because it demonstrates with unusual clarity that there is no private life left in the ordinary sense. The park is not a private space, but it is the kind of space that ordinary people use as though it were, casually, without performing, without the consciousness of being watched. After the spring of 1997, Carolyn no longer has access to that kind of space anywhere in the city. The effect on her daily existence is difficult to overstate. Manhattan, which is a city that ordinarily offers a kind of anonymity in its density, the crowd as cover, the noise as privacy, has ceased to function that way for her. She cannot walk without being followed. She cannot sit in a restaurant near a window without being photographed through it. She cannot have a visible emotional reaction in any semi-public space without that reaction being recorded and interpreted and published with a caption that someone else has written. The city, which she has lived in and navigated with skill and pleasure since her early 20s, has become a place she must be defended against. She withdraws, not dramatically, not all at once, but incrementally and with increasing consistency. Friends from the Calvin Klein years describe a shift in her availability. She is harder to reach, less likely to suggest meeting in the kinds of places they used to frequent together, more comfortable in private homes than public spaces. She is not, by their accounts, unhappy in any way she is willing to name directly. She is simply less present in the city than she used to be, and the less present she becomes, the more her absence is noticed and written about, which creates a specific kind of trap. Withdrawal generates coverage that makes the original impulse to withdraw feel more justified, which generates more withdrawal, in a cycle that has no natural exit point. John's response to the media attention is different from Carolyn's in ways that create friction between them. He has lived with public scrutiny his entire life and has developed a tolerance for it, or something that functions like tolerance, though it is perhaps more accurate to say he has developed an ability to compartmentalize it, to treat the cameras as weather, unpleasant but unavoidable, and to move through them without significant alteration to his behavior. He understands the photographers and the gossip columns as part of the landscape of his life. Carolyn does not share this understanding. The landscape she is living in is not the one she chose, and she has not had 40 years to develop the specific numbness that long-term exposure to public scrutiny can produce. By late 1997, the photographs of Carolyn that circulate most widely are the ones in which she is moving away, leaving buildings, entering cars, crossing streets with the focused efficiency of someone who has learned that stillness is an invitation. She is always in motion, she is always composed, and she is, in almost every image from this period, entirely alone. The apartment on North Moore Street has high ceilings and large windows, and the kind of industrial bones that Tribeca lofts acquired in the 1980s when artists moved into spaces that manufacturing had vacated. By the mid-1990s, the neighborhood has gentrified considerably. The artists have largely been replaced by people with money who want the aesthetic the artists created. And the loft that John Kennedy has lived in for several years carries that specific quality of downtown New York, cool, that is itself a form of performance, a way of saying that the person who lives here has chosen authenticity over the obvious options that his name and his money could have purchased uptown. Carolyn moves into this space as John's wife in the fall of 1996, and she changes it. Not dramatically, not in a way that erases what was there before, but with the quiet precision that characterizes everything she does with environments. She brings in objects that reflect her taste, a more refined palette, cleaner lines, a sense of considered arrangement that the loft, which had the comfortable disorder of a bachelor's space, did not previously have. The people who visit during this period remark on how the apartment feels different, more intentional, more hers, in some way, even though it has always been his. This small act of domestic assertion is, in retrospect, one of the few spaces in her marriage where Carolyn exercises clear agency. The rest of the marriage, as it develops through 1997 and into 1998, is organized predominantly around John's life. His magazine, his social world, his family obligations, his ambitions. In a way that gradually, and then less gradually, crowds out the question of what Carolyn's life is supposed to be. George Magazine, which John founded in 1995 with the political satirist John Besh, and which publishes at the intersection of politics and popular culture, is the central organizing fact of his professional life during these years. He is its editor and its public face, and he approaches both roles with genuine enthusiasm and considerable charm. The magazine is not a vanity project exactly. John cares about it, works hard at it, has real ideas about what it should be. But it is also inextricably tied to his name in a way that makes its commercial viability dependent on his continued visibility. He needs to be seen, and he knows it, and he navigates the tension between his own desire for privacy and his magazine's need for his public presence with varying degrees of success. Carolyn's relationship to George is complicated from the beginning. She has opinions about it. She has worked in image-driven industries for a decade and has a sophisticated understanding of branding and presentation. And John both values her instincts and resists, at times, the implication that his project requires her expertise. The conversations about the magazine that friends overhear during this period are not always comfortable. She pushes, he deflects, or digs in, or changes the subject. The dynamic is not unfamiliar to anyone who has watched two strong-willed people try to negotiate the space between professional respect and marital authority. Beyond the magazine, there is the question of what Carolyn is doing with her own professional life. She has left Calvin Klein. This departure, which happens around the time of the wedding, is presented publicly as a matter of circumstance. The intensity of the media attention makes maintaining a normal working life difficult, but the people close to her describe it as more complicated than that. She does not, in the months after leaving Calvin Klein, pursue another position. She is not looking, at least not in any way that becomes visible. She is, for the first time in her adult life, without a professional identity, and the absence of that identity, which has been her primary source of self-definition since her early 20s, creates a vacancy that neither the marriage nor the social world she now inhabits is equipped to fill. What fills it, instead, is management. The management of the couple's public image, the management of their social calendar, the management of the specific and exhausting logistics of being John Kennedy's wife in a city that treats every public appearance as an occasion. This is skilled work, and Carolyn does it with the same competence she brought to everything else, but it is not work in any meaningful sense. It is maintenance. It is the application of professional-grade skills to the project of sustaining a life that she did not entirely design. The arguments that punctuate the marriage during this period are, by the accounts of the people who witness them, substantial. They fight about his lateness. John is constitutionally, almost defiantly, unpunctual, a quality that Carolyn, who is precise and organized and professionally trained to respect other people's time, finds genuinely maddening. They fight about his friendships, some of which are with women whose history with John predates the marriage, and whose continued presence in his social world Carolyn finds, at minimum, worth discussing. They fight about the magazine, about money, about the degree to which the Kennedy family's expectations should govern decisions that she believes ought to be theirs alone. What the arguments are actually about, beneath the surface complaints, is harder to name, but not hard to observe. Two people who are each accustomed to a certain kind of control. Control over their environment, their image, the terms of their relationships, have built a life together in which neither can fully exercise that control without encroaching on the others. The equilibrium this requires is delicate and exhausting, and there are stretches in the marriage where it is simply not maintained. There are also, by the accounts of the same people, stretches of what sounds like genuine closeness. Friends who visit the loft describe evenings that are warm and easy, the two of them relaxed and funny together in the way that couples are when the performance falls away, and something more private emerges. John's affection for Carolyn is not in question. Carolyn's feeling for John, whatever its complications, is not in question either. The marriage is not a cold arrangement. It is something more painful than that. A genuine attachment between two people who cannot quite find a way to be together that does not cost one or both of them something significant. By 1998, the people closest to Carolyn describe a woman who is thinner than she was at the wedding, who smokes more than she used to, who is occasionally difficult to reach, and then suddenly intensely present, as though compensating for an absence she has not explained. Something in her has quieted in a way that is not the same as peace. There is a photograph from a public appearance in late 1997 in which Carolyn is standing beside John at some kind of event. The specific occasion is less important than what the photograph shows, which is a woman who has lost a visible amount of weight since the wedding photographs 14 months earlier. Her face is sharper. Her collarbones are more prominent. She is dressed impeccably, as always, and she is composed, as always, and if you are looking at the photograph casually, you might not notice anything. If you are looking at it with attention, you notice everything. The weight loss is remarked upon in the press during this period, in the way that the press remarks on the bodies of famous women. With a combination of concern and appetite that is difficult to separate into its component parts. The coverage frames it variously as a fashion choice, a stress response, a sign of marital trouble, a reflection of her proximity to the fashion industry's standards. None of the coverage asks her directly, because the coverage never asks her anything directly. She does not give interviews, she does not make statements, she is present in the public record only through images, and the images say what they say while she remains silent. What is happening to her body during this period is, by the accounts of people who know her, an expression of something internal that has no other outlet. She is not eating with the regularity or the sufficiency that she was before the wedding, and the reasons for this are not simple or singular. There is the stress of the marriage, which is real and sustained. There is the loss of her professional identity, which has removed from her life a daily structure that was also a daily source of meaning. There is the relentlessness of the public attention, which has converted the ordinary physical act of moving through the world into a managed performance that requires constant energy to maintain. And there is something else, harder to name, a quality of depletion that the people closest to her recognize but cannot locate precisely, as though something fundamental is being consumed faster than it can be restored. Her former colleagues from Calvin Klein, the ones she remains close to, notice the change. She is still warm when she is present, still capable of the focused attention that has always been her primary social gift, but she is present less frequently and for shorter durations. Lunches are canceled, plans are made and then quietly unmade. There is a sense among the people who care about her of a woman who is managing her own visibility, not just to the press and the public, but to the people who know her, as though even intimacy has become something that requires more energy than she reliably has. She is also during this period relying on cigarettes with an intensity that goes beyond habit. This is documented not in any formal sense, but in the photographs. She is frequently photographed smoking outside the loft, outside restaurants, on sidewalks. And in the recollections of friends who note that the cigarettes have become for Carolyn a form of punctuation. She smokes between tasks, between conversations, in the moments that used to be occupied by other things. It is the behavior of someone who has found, in a small and controllable chemical ritual, a substitute for something larger and less controllable that is missing. The marriage continues to be turbulent in the ways it has always been turbulent, with the additional pressure of John's intensifying political ambitions. He is being discussed with increasing seriousness as a likely candidate for the Senate seat being vacated by Daniel Patrick Moynihan. The discussions are not yet public declarations, but they are real, and they carry implications for the life Carolyn is already struggling to inhabit. A Senate candidacy would mean a more public marriage, more public appearances, more of the managed visibility that has already cost her considerably. It would mean campaigns and fundraisers and the specific performance of political wifehood that is its own demanding and largely unrewarded form of labor. Carolyn does not, by any account, want this. She does not say this publicly because she does not say anything publicly, but among the people she trusts, she is clear enough. She has not signed up to be a political wife. She has signed up to be John's wife, which she understood would be public and difficult, but which she perhaps did not understand would be subject to ongoing renegotiation in directions she cannot control or refuse. There is also, during 1998, a period of separation. The accounts of this separation vary in their details. How long it lasted, where each of them stayed, what precipitated it. But its existence is not in serious dispute. They are apart for a period of weeks, possibly longer, and the separation is not a mutual cooling off so much as a fracture that requires active repair. They do repair it. They come back together. But the repair has the quality of something that has been glued rather than healed, functional under ordinary pressure, vulnerable under anything more demanding. The friends who see Carolyn in the latter part of 1998 and into 1999 describe a woman in a state of managed tension that is becoming increasingly difficult to manage. She is not, in these accounts, broken or despairing in any dramatic sense. She is still herself, funny, perceptive, capable of genuine warmth. But the self that is present is a reduced version of what it was. She has less energy. She sleeps irregularly. She is, on certain days, difficult to reach emotionally in a way that goes beyond ordinary unavailability. What she is losing in these years is not happiness in any simple sense. It is something more structural than that. The sense of forward motion that has organized her life since adolescence. In Greenwich, she was moving toward something. In Boston, she was moving toward something. At Calvin Klein, she was moving toward something. The movement gave her life its shape and its purpose, and, in a way she may not have fully recognized until it was gone, its meaning. In the apartment on North Moore Street, in the fall of 1998, she is not moving toward anything she has chosen. The year turns. John's conversations about the Senate seat continue. George Magazine is struggling financially in ways that create new pressure in the marriage. And Carolyn, who has spent her entire adult life constructing and maintaining a surface that the world cannot penetrate, is finding that the surface requires more effort to hold than it once did. There is a gathering at the Kennedy compound in Hyannisport in the summer of 1998 that several people who were present have described, in various accounts over the years, in ways that are individually partial and collectively revealing. It is not a formal event, and the Kennedy family does not, for the most part, organize itself around formal events in the way that other wealthy families do. It is the kind of gathering that happens because the compound exists and the family gravitates toward it, particularly in summer with the specific pull of a place that has been the site of enough shared history to have acquired the character of a gravitational center. Carolyn is there. She is present in the way she is always present at these gatherings, composed, cordial, carefully appropriate in her behavior toward the family members she knows less well and warmer with the few she has developed genuine ease with. She participates in the surface of the occasion. She does not, by the accounts of people present, participate in its interior. The unspoken conversations, the running references to shared history, the particular humor that families develop over decades of proximity, and that functions, among other things, as a sorting mechanism. You either get it or you don't, and if you don't, the not getting is visible in small ways that accumulate. She does not get all of it. This is not a failure of intelligence or effort. It is a structural condition. She did not grow up in this family. She did not spend summers at this compound in childhood, did not absorb its rhythms and its codes and its specific way of being together. She arrived as an adult, as a wife, into a family that had been forming itself for decades before she existed, and the formation is not something that can be reverse engineered through goodwill or social skill, however considerable. The Kennedy women who have married into the family before her, Ethel, Joan, various others across the generations, have navigated this position in ways that range from apparently successful absorption to quiet devastation. Joan Kennedy's struggles are the most publicly documented: her alcoholism, her increasing marginalization within the family, the specific loneliness of being a Kennedy wife without the protection of being a Kennedy. And they constitute, whether anyone acknowledges it or not, a kind of cautionary record that predates Carolyn's arrival by decades. The family has seen what this position does to people. It has not, as a family, made significant adjustments to the position. Carolyn's relationship with Carolyn Kennedy is particularly worth attending to, because it is the relationship within the family that carries the most potential and delivers, by most accounts, the least. Caroline is John's sister and his closest family member, the person who has known him longest and most completely, and her opinion of Carolyn matters in ways that go beyond the personal. Caroline is also by temperament a private person, guarded, self-contained, organized around the protection of her family's interior life from the perpetual intrusions of the public world. She and Carolyn are, in this sense, temperamentally similar, which might have been the basis for genuine closeness, and is instead apparently a source of friction. Two people who each use privacy as a primary defense mechanism are not necessarily equipped to make themselves vulnerable to each other. The relationship between them is described by people close to both as cordial and cool. The kind of functional civility that families produce when genuine warmth has not developed and open conflict would be too costly. They are not enemies. They are not friends. They are women who have each organized their lives around the management of a particular kind of exposure, who share a family and a famous name, and who have not found a way across the distance that their respective forms of self-protection maintain between them. The male Kennedys present their own set of complications. The cousins, and there are many, spread across a generation that has struggled publicly with addiction, legal trouble, and the specific difficulty of inheriting a mythology rather than a manageable legacy. Regard Carolyn with varying degrees of warmth and wariness. She is John's wife, which means she is family, which means she is entitled to a certain baseline of inclusion. But she is also an outsider, which means she is not entirely trusted, which means that the inclusion has limits that are felt even when they are not stated. John navigates all of this with the particular skill of someone who has spent his entire life being the center of a family that is also a public institution. He loves his family and is exhausted by it in equal measure, and he moves between those two states with a fluency that looks, from outside, like ease. But for Carolyn, who does not have his decades of practice, the navigation is more effortful and less successful. She is charming where she needs to be charming. She is present where she needs to be present. But the effort required to do all of this, on top of everything else her life is requiring of her, is not invisible to the people paying close attention. There are specific gatherings she does not attend. A family event in late 1997 that she is expected at and does not appear. A holiday occasion in 1998 where her absence is noted and not explained. Each individual absence has an explanation. She is unwell. She has a prior commitment. The details are never quite confirmed. But the pattern of the absences, taken together, says something that the individual explanations cannot account for. She is withdrawing from the family in the same way she is withdrawn from the city, incrementally, with plausible individual justifications that collectively describe a person who is finding it increasingly difficult to perform the version of herself that these occasions require. The family notices. The noticing is not sympathetic for the most part. In a family that has sustained itself through public tragedy by requiring its members to show up and perform regardless of internal condition, Carolyn's absences read not as distress signals, but as failures of commitment. The distinction between a person who cannot show up and a person who will not is not one the Kennedy family, in this period, appears particularly interested in making. She is still John's wife. She is still photographed on his arm at the occasions she does attend. She is still, from the outside, part of the most famous family in America. From the inside, she is increasingly adjacent to it, close enough to feel its weight, too far inside the structure to find the exit. By the spring of 1999, the conversations about John Kennedy running for the United States Senate seat in New York have moved from speculation into something closer to planning. Daniel Patrick Moynihan, has announced he will not seek re-election. The seat is open. The Democratic field is beginning to take shape. Hillary Clinton is considering a run, which creates its own set of complications and comparisons. But John's name is being raised in conversations at levels of the party that do not raise names casually, and the people around him, advisors, family members, longtime Kennedy allies who have been waiting for precisely this moment, are beginning to organize themselves around the possibility with the quiet efficiency of people who have been through this before. John is not a declared candidate. He is careful, publicly, to neither confirm nor deny the discussions, which is itself a form of political behavior. The management of anticipation, the cultivation of inevitability without the vulnerability of a formal declaration. He has done this before, in a smaller way, with George Magazine. Allowed the idea of the thing to build before committing to the reality of it. And he does it now with the Senate seat in a way that suggests either genuine ambivalence about running or a sophisticated understanding of how to enter a race at maximum advantage. What he is less careful about in this period is what a Senate campaign would mean for his marriage. The conversations that Carolyn is part of, and she is part of some of them, less than she should be, more than she perhaps wants to be, are not conversations about what she thinks or what she is willing to do. They are conversations about what is possible, what is required, what the campaign would need from both of them. The framing is logistical rather than consensual, and the distinction matters enormously to a woman who has been living, for the past 3 years, inside a set of conditions she did not design. A Senate campaign in New York in 1999 requires, for a Kennedy, a specific kind of public marriage. Not merely a wife who appears at events and stands at the correct distance and smiles at the correct moments, though it requires that, but a wife who is legible to the public as a partner, as a person with her own substance, as evidence that the candidate is a man of settled personal life rather than the perennial bachelor that the tabloids have been writing about for a decade. Carolyn is, in physical and aesthetic terms, precisely the kind of wife that a Kennedy Senate campaign would want. She is also, in temperamental and personal terms, perhaps the least equipped person in her immediate circle to perform that role without significant cost. She does not want to be a political wife. This is not a new position. She has held it since the marriage, has expressed it to friends with varying degrees of directness, has made it clear in the private conversations that the people closest to her are careful about repeating. What is new in the spring of 1999 is that the not wanting has become urgent in a way it was not before. The Senate discussions are no longer hypothetical. The timeline is becoming concrete. The life she has been living, difficult, constrained, but at least not a campaign, is about to become something more demanding and less private, and even further from anything she chose. John's ambitions are, in every account of his life, genuine. He is not a man playing at politics because of his name. He cares about public service in a way that is consistent with how he has always talked about his life and his sense of obligation. George Magazine was, among other things, a way of engaging with political life without submitting to its full demands, and the fact that he is now considering the submission suggests that the partial engagement is no longer sufficient. He is 38 years old. His mother is gone. The magazine is struggling. The question of what he is supposed to do with his life, a question that has followed him since Dallas, since the salute, since the world decided what he was before he could decide for himself, is pressing on him with renewed force. What John wants and what Carolyn can give are not, in the spring of 1999, aligned. This is not a new condition in their marriage, but it has acquired a new urgency, and the people around them, the Kennedy advisors, the political operatives, the family members who have a stake in what John does next, are not, for the most part, focusing on the alignment problem. They are focusing on the opportunity. Carolyn's readiness, her willingness, her own sense of what her life should contain. These are secondary considerations in a conversation primarily about what John Kennedy is going to do. George Magazine is by this point in genuine financial difficulty. The concept that animated it, politics as culture, celebrity as political commentary, has not translated into the sustained commercial success the magazine needs. Hachette Filipacci, the publisher, is growing impatient. The conversations about the magazine's future are uncomfortable, and they create in John a pressure that compounds the pressure of the Senate discussions and the pressure of the marriage, all of it accumulating in a man who is, by the spring of 1999, carrying more than he is showing. The marriage in this context is not collapsing, it is straining. There is a difference, and the people around them in this period are careful to maintain it, to describe what they observe as difficulty rather than dissolution, as a rough period rather than an ending. They are together. They are in the apartment. They are trying. But the trying has the quality of two people working very hard at something that is not getting easier with the effort. Carolyn is thinner than she was a year ago. She is smoking more. She has canceled enough plans with enough people that her social circle has contracted to a small core of people who have proven through repeated contact that they can be trusted not to require more of her than she has. She is still funny, still sharp, still capable of the focused warmth that has always been the most recognizable thing about her, but she deploys it in smaller doses, for shorter durations, and then retreats. The summer approaches. John is talking about flying more. He has had his pilot's license for 2 years, flies a Piper Saratoga, and has been building hours with the intention of becoming more independent in the air. Carolyn does not share his enthusiasm for the flying. She has expressed discomfort about it to friends on more than one occasion. The summer of 1999 arrives. It will be very short. The weekend of July 16th, 1999 begins as a logistical problem before it becomes anything else. John and Carolyn are expected at the wedding of his cousin Rory Kennedy in Hyannisport, the Cape Cod compound, the family gathering point, the place Carolyn has spent 3 years learning to navigate with decreasing success. The wedding is on Saturday evening. John intends to fly them there in his Piper Saratoga 2TC, a single-engine aircraft he has owned since April 1998, and has been flying with accumulating hours, but not by several professional assessments made in the period before the flight, accumulating sufficient experience for the conditions he will encounter on the night of July 16th. Lauren Bessette, Carolyn's sister, is joining them. She works for Morgan Stanley in New York, is 34 years old, and is traveling to the Vineyard separately from the Cape. John will drop her at Martha's Vineyard Airport before continuing to Hyannisport with Carolyn. The addition of Lauren to the flight is, in the accounts of people close to both families, a practical arrangement rather than a complicated one. She needs to get to the Vineyard. John is flying to the Cape. The Vineyard is on the way. It makes sense. What makes less sense, and what has been analyzed in enormous detail in the years since, is the decision to fly at all on the night of July 16th under the conditions that exist. John's leg is in a cast. He fractured his ankle in a paragliding accident in June and is flying with a removable cast, which affects his physical mobility in the cockpit in ways that are not trivial. The weather over the Atlantic on the evening of the 16th is hazy, the kind of summer haze that reduces visibility over water to the point where the horizon disappears, where the sky and the ocean become the same dark surface, and a pilot without sufficient instrument experience cannot, by sensation alone, determine which way is up. John does not have sufficient instrument experience. He holds a private pilot certificate. He has logged approximately 300 hours of flight time, which is not a negligible amount, but is not the kind of experience that the National Transportation Safety Board, in its subsequent investigation, considers adequate for flight over water at night in hazy conditions without a flight instructor. He has flown the route before. He knows it. This familiarity is, in a specific and documented way, part of the problem. It creates a confidence that the conditions on this particular night do not warrant. There is a discussion in the hours before the flight about whether to fly at all. A flight instructor who has been working with John offers to accompany him on the trip. John declines. The specific reasons for the declination are not recorded in any way that allows certainty, but the people who knew him describe a man who was, in the final months of his life, asserting his independence with particular intensity. From the Kennedy family's expectations, from the magazine's difficulties, from the accumulated pressures of a life that had never fully been his to direct. The flying was his. The decision to fly was his. The declination of assistance fits a pattern. They leave Essex County Airport in New Jersey at approximately 8:38 in the evening. The flight plan is not formally filed, which is legal for a VFR flight. but which means there is no official record of the intended route. They are expected at the Vineyard at approximately 9:15. Carolyn has been reluctant about the flight. This is documented in multiple accounts from people she has spoken to in the preceding days, and it is consistent with the discomfort about John's flying that she has expressed on previous occasions. Whether her reluctance is expressed again in the hours before departure, whether there is an argument, whether she boards the plane with full consent or with the resigned compliance of a woman who has learned that some of John's decisions are not negotiable. None of this is known with certainty. What is known is that she boards. Lauren boards. John pilots the Saratoga off the runway at 8:38 and heads northeast over the water. For the first portion of the flight, the data recovered from radar tracking suggests normal operation. The plane climbs to approximately 5,500 feet and proceeds on a generally northeastern heading. Then, at approximately 9:40 p.m., the radar returns show the plane beginning a descent. The descent is not gradual. It is the kind of descent that investigators call a graveyard spiral, a loss of spatial orientation, in which the pilot, unable to distinguish the horizon in haze and darkness, enters a turn that the body interprets as level flight, while the aircraft spirals toward the water with accelerating speed. The plane hits the ocean approximately 7.5 miles from the Martha's Vineyard coast. The impact is at high speed. There are no distress calls. The water is approximately 116 feet deep at the impact site. They are not reported missing immediately because their flight was not formally tracked, and because the Vineyard contact, a Kennedy family member waiting for Lauren, assumes a delay rather than a disaster. The missing persons report comes through the night. The search begins. It takes 5 days to locate the wreckage. The bodies are recovered on July 21st, John, Carolyn, and Lauren, found together in the wreckage near the ocean floor. The recovery operation is conducted by Navy divers and is treated by the Kennedy family and the relevant government agencies as a matter requiring careful management. The bodies are cremated. The ashes of John and Carolyn are scattered at sea from a Navy vessel in a ceremony that is private and brief and attended by family members. Carolyn Bessette-Kennedy is 33 years old. The apartment on North Moore Street, with its high ceilings and its carefully chosen objects and its evidence of a woman who tried, in a very limited space, to build something that was recognizably hers, is emptied in the months that follow by people making decisions about what to keep and what to discard. Her name is on the lease. It is one of the last places her name is on anything. The public mourning that follows the crash of July 16th is, by any measure, enormous. The coverage begins within hours of the missing persons report and does not stop for weeks. Television networks interrupt regular programming. Newspapers run multiple editions. The water off Martha's Vineyard becomes, within 24 hours, one of the most photographed stretches of ocean in the world. Coast Guard vessels, Navy ships, press helicopters circling at the permitted altitude, cameras pointed at a surface that shows nothing, recording the absence as though the absence itself is news. John F. Kennedy Jr. is the story. This is not a decision that anyone makes consciously. It is the outcome of everything the culture has invested in him since November 1963, the accumulated weight of 36 years of public attention finally arriving at its terminus. The grief that the coverage channels is real, genuinely felt by people who have grown up with his image, who have tracked his life with the specific intimacy that sustained media attention produces, who experience his death as the loss of something they feel they owned a portion of. The grief is real, and it is also, in the way that all publicly mediated grief is, organized around a story that the culture already knows how to tell. Carolyn is in that story. She appears in the coverage with regularity, in photographs, in the biographical summaries that journalists produce in the hours after a death, when the deadline pressure is absolute and the sourcing is whatever can be assembled quickly. She is described as his wife, as a former Calvin Klein publicist, a title that is not quite accurate but that has attached itself to her public identity through repetition, as beautiful, as private, as someone who struggled with the demands of her public role. These descriptions are not wrong exactly. They are partial in a way that is invisible within the coverage because the coverage does not have the time or the interest to make them more complete. What happens to her identity in the weeks following the crash is a process of compression. The woman who spent 3 years trying to maintain some version of a self inside a marriage and a family and a public world that each made different and competing claims on her is reduced in the coverage to a supporting element of a story about someone else. She was his wife. She was on the plane. She died with him. The sentence structure of her death is passive in a way that her life was not. She was taken, she was lost, she was mourned, and the mourning itself is conducted in terms that are about John's loss rather than her own. The Kennedy family moves quickly in the days after the recovery of the bodies. This is consistent with how the family has always operated in the aftermath of catastrophe, with a speed and an organizational efficiency that reflects decades of practice managing public tragedy at the highest level. There are lawyers involved within hours. There are decisions made about the funeral arrangements, the memorial service, the handling of the estate, the public communications. These decisions are made by Kennedys, for Kennedys, with the Bessette family present at the margins in a way that mirrors, with painful precision, their position at the wedding 3 years earlier. The memorial service is held at the Church of St. Thomas More on the Upper East Side on July 23rd. It is a Catholic Mass. The attendees include family members, close friends, political figures, and a selection of the public world that John inhabited. It is, by all accounts, moving and well-organized and entirely centered on John. Carolyn is mourned within it, and Lauren is mourned within it, but the service has the shape and the weight of a Kennedy funeral, which is what it is, and the two women who died alongside him are present in it as losses within his story rather than as subjects of their own. Anne-Marie Bessette, Carolyn's mother, attends the service. She sits with her daughters, Carolyn's sisters, Lisa and Lauren's twin, in the rows designated for family, surrounded by Kennedys, at a funeral for her daughter that she did not plan and has very little control over. What she experiences in those hours is not recorded in any public account with any precision. She does not speak to the press. She does not give interviews. She is, in the coverage, a peripheral figure, the mother of the wife, present at the edges of a story about a family that is not hers. The estate settlement in the months following the crash proceeds through the legal system with the kind of speed and opacity that significant wealth enables. John's estate is valued at approximately $100 million, which includes the Tribeca loft, investments, personal property, and his share of various assets. The will, executed before the marriage, not updated afterward, leaves the bulk of the estate to the Kennedy family trust. Carolyn, as his wife, has legal standing in the settlement, but she is dead, and the standing passes not in a direction that meaningfully benefits her family. The Bessette family receives very little, not nothing. The legal architecture of marriage and death and estate law is not entirely indifferent to their claim, but very little relative to the scale of the assets involved and very little relative to what Carolyn gave up. Professionally, personally, in terms of the life she did not live, in the years of the marriage. The asymmetry is not discussed publicly. It is handled quietly in legal proceedings that are not reported in detail by people whose professional interest is in resolution rather than equity. The Tribeca loft is sold. The objects Carolyn chose for it are dispersed, some to the estate, some to family, some through channels that are not tracked publicly. The apartment that she worked to make hers, in the limited way the marriage allowed, is emptied and sold and eventually renovated by its new owners into something that bears no trace of what it was. The Calvin Klein archives contain photographs of her from her working years, professional images taken for commercial purposes in which she is always impeccably turned out and always slightly unreachable. These images circulate after her death with renewed frequency. She is, in them, exactly what the industry needed her to be. She is not, in any of them, herself in any sense that goes beyond the surface. Her name appears on the crash reports, the estate documents, the memorial service program. In each of these it appears after his or beside his or as a dependent clause in a sentence whose main subject is someone else. Anne-Marie Freeman does not speak to the press in the days after the crash. She does not speak to the press in the weeks after the crash. She does not, in any meaningful public sense, speak about her daughter at all in the months and years that follow. Not in interviews, not in authorized biographies, not in the memorial volumes and magazine retrospectives and documentary projects that accumulate around the Kennedy name with the regularity of a tide that has no interest in what it covers. This silence is, in the landscape of American public grief, unusual. The families of people who die in high-profile circumstances are generally subject to enormous pressure from media, from publishers, from documentary producers, from the general appetite that the public develops for the interior lives of people it has been watching from outside. The pressure on Anne-Marie Freeman is considerable. She receives requests. The requests are declined. The silence holds. It would be easy to read this silence as dignity. Erosion, the private grief of a mother who has lost two daughters in a single night, refusing to convert that grief into content. And it is that. But it is also something else, something that the silence itself cannot quite contain. The position of a woman who watched her daughter absorbed into a family and a public story that was never hers, and who now finds, in the aftermath of the absorption, that she has no standing from which to reclaim her. Carolyn's sister, Lisa Bessette, is equally silent. She gives no interviews. She makes no public statements. She withdraws from the New York world she had been living in and does so with a completeness that is, in a media environment that rewards visibility, almost aggressive in its thoroughness. She is photographed occasionally in the years after the crash, in circumstances that are clearly accidental, an image taken by a street photographer, a brief appearance at a legal proceeding. But she does not present herself for documentation. She does not tell her sister's story. She does not correct the record on the points where the record is incomplete or wrong. What the Bessette family knows about Carolyn that the public record does not contain is a question that cannot be answered from outside the silence. But the shape of what is missing is visible in what the public record does contain. The accounts of Carolyn's life that proliferate after her death are drawn almost entirely from Kennedy-adjacent sources. Friends of John, members of the Kennedy family, people whose primary relationship was with him rather than with her. The portrait that emerges from these sources is of a woman seen from a particular angle, as John's wife, as a presence in his life, as a complication in his story, rather than as someone with an interior life that preceded and exceeded the marriage. The one biography of Carolyn that is published in the years after her death, a volume that draws on interviews with people who knew her, is notable less for what it reveals than for how often its sources speak about John when asked about Carolyn. The gravitational pull of the Kennedy story is so strong that even in a book nominally about her, she is frequently discussed in relation to him. Her childhood is covered in several pages. Her years at Calvin Klein are covered in several pages. Her marriage receives the bulk of the attention, which is the proportion that reflects not the weight of her life, but the weight of his name. Her mother's remarriage into the Freeman family, which gave Carolyn access to a world she would otherwise not have encountered, is mentioned in these accounts primarily as biographical context rather than as something that shaped her in ways worth examining. The stepfather, Richard Freeman, is a peripheral figure in the public record, present at the wedding, present at the memorial, otherwise absent from the coverage. What the Freemans experienced as a family in the aftermath of the crash, the loss of two members of their household, the legal and financial proceedings that followed, the management of their grief within a public narrative that had no space for them, is not something the public record illuminates with any care. The legal proceedings around the estate take several years to fully resolve. The Bessette family's position in those proceedings is, from the outside, one of limited leverage. Carolyn died without a will of her own. She was 33 years old, and the making of wills is something that most 33-year-olds have not yet attended to, which means that the disposition of any assets that might have been considered hers passes through a legal framework that is organized around the Kennedy estate rather than the Bessette family's interests. The specific outcomes of these proceedings are not matters of public record, which is itself a function of wealth. The ability to resolve financial disputes in private, away from the documentation that public proceedings would create. What the Bessette family is left with in the most concrete sense, is their grief and their silence, and a set of memories that belong to no archive anyone has access to. They have photographs, presumably. Family photographs, the kind that exist in every household and that record the ordinary moments that public photography ignores. Carolyn at a kitchen table, Carolyn at a birthday. Carolyn laughing at something that has nothing to do with John Kennedy or Calvin Klein or the cameras outside the North Moore Street building. These images do not circulate. They have not been published, have not appeared in the retrospectives, have not been included in the documentary projects. They belong to the people who took them, who are the people who are not talking. There's a lawsuit filed by the Bessette family in the years after the crash against the Kennedy estate, the details of which are sealed. That it exists is a matter of public record. What it alleges, what it seeks, what it ultimately achieves. These are questions that the public record answers only in outline. A dispute existed. It was resolved. The resolution is private. The silence continues. Anne-Marie Freeman, in the years that the public record tracks her, does not emerge from it. She does not write a memoir. She does not participate in the documentaries. She does not, in any medium that has been recorded, speak her daughter's name in public. She knows things that no one else knows. She will not be asked about them in any venue that reaches the public. What her daughter's life felt like from inside. What Carolyn told her in the conversations that private families have. What she understood about the marriage that the Kennedy-adjacent sources do not. All of it remains where the Bessette family has placed it. In silence. Out of reach. Entirely theirs. In the years after July 1999, something happens to Carolyn Bessette-Kennedy that is distinct from what happens to most people who die young and publicly. She does not fade. She does not become in the way that most figures at the periphery of famous stories become, a footnote. A name that appears in parentheses, a face in a photograph that requires a caption. She persists. She circulates. She returns with the regularity of a tide to the surface of the culture that consumed her while she was alive and continues to consume her after she is gone. The mechanism of the consumption has changed. The appetite has not. The fashion industry finds her first, which is appropriate in the way that dark things are sometimes appropriate. Within a year of her death, the aesthetic she embodied, the minimal, the restrained, the expensively understated, begins to appear in collections and editorial spreads and trend pieces with a frequency that is not coincidental. Designers do not, for the most part, name her directly. They do not need to. The visual language is specific enough that the reference is legible to anyone paying attention. The ivory bias-cut dress is reproduced in variations that are sold as homage and function as appropriation. The pulled-back hair, the clean lines, the quality of controlled elegance that she spent 20 years developing, all of it is absorbed into the industry's vocabulary without acknowledgement of the person from whom it was taken. This is not unusual. The fashion industry has always fed on the images of the women who move through it, converting their particular qualities into general aesthetics that can be reproduced and sold at scale. What is unusual is the duration and the intensity of the feeding. Carolyn's image does not become vintage, does not acquire the patina of a specific historical moment that marks it as belonging to a particular decade. It remains, 20 years after her death, somehow current, reproduced in Instagram posts and Pinterest boards and fashion retrospectives with the freshness of something that has not aged, which is partly a function of how precisely she calibrated her aesthetic and partly a function of how completely her silence has preserved it. She cannot correct the record. She cannot object to the uses to which her image is put. She cannot clarify what the aesthetic meant to her, as opposed to what it means to the people who have inherited it. She is, in death as in much of her marriage, available to be used in ways she did not choose, by people who do not require her participation. The documentaries begin in earnest around the 20th anniversary of the crash, in 2019. There are multiple productions, streaming platforms, network specials, podcast series, each of which promises, in its promotional materials, to tell the story of Carolyn Bessette-Kennedy rather than the story of JFK Jr.'s wife. Most of them do not deliver on this promise. The gravitational pull of the Kennedy story is as strong in 2019 as it was in 1999, and the sources available to documentary makers are still predominantly Kennedy adjacent, and the narrative architecture of the production still organizes itself almost inevitably around John, his life, his death, his loss, with Carolyn as the most significant supporting element. There is in these documentaries a recurring moment that appears in various forms across multiple productions. Someone who knew Carolyn, a friend, a colleague, a person who encountered her briefly in a professional context, is asked to describe her, and they begin to speak, and then something happens in their expression that is not grief exactly, but is adjacent to it. A recognition that what they are about to say will not be sufficient, that the person they are trying to describe does not fit inside the frame that the documentary has constructed for her, that the question being asked, who was she really, is one that the format cannot accommodate the answer to. These moments are, in their way, more revealing than anything else in the productions. They are the record of an absence. The person the documentaries are trying to locate is not available in the sources the documentaries have access to, because the sources are the wrong sources, and the frame is the wrong frame, and the Bessette family, which holds the only archive that might answer the question differently, has declined to participate. The internet, in the decade following her death, generates its own parallel record. Fashion blogs and tribute accounts accumulate thousands of images. Style analyses break down her wardrobe choices with an attention to detail that exceeds anything written about her as a person. She becomes, on certain corners of the internet, a kind of ideal, a woman who got dressing right, who understood something about restraint and elegance that the current moment lacks. The tributes are sincere, and they are also, in the way all tributes to surfaces are, a form of erasure. The more precisely the image is celebrated, the more completely the person behind it disappears. There are girls born after 1999 who know Carolyn Bessette-Kennedy's name primarily as a style reference, who have pinned her photographs without knowing the year they were taken, or the circumstances of her death, or the name of her mother, or the fact that she had a professional life before the marriage that was, by any reasonable assessment, more fully hers than the life the marriage gave her. For these girls, she is an aesthetic, a quality of cool, a way of wearing clothes, a standard of a particular kind of beauty that is also somehow a standard of a particular kind of silence. The silence is the most faithfully reproduced element of her image. She never spoke publicly. She gave no interviews. She produced no account of her own experience. And the culture, which could not penetrate the silence while she was alive, has simply continued to produce content around it after she is gone, filling the space she would not fill herself with versions of her that serve its own needs. She is 33 years old in every photograph. She's always leaving a building, or standing at a slight remove from a crowd, or caught in the particular quality of light that existed on some specific afternoon in the 1990s that no one can exactly reproduce. She is always composed. She is always slightly elsewhere. She is always just barely out of reach. There is no version of Carolyn Bessette-Kennedy's life that resolves cleanly. The pieces do not arrange themselves into a shape that delivers either condemnation or consolation. What remains when the coverage and the retrospectives and the fashion tributes are set aside is a set of facts that sit in uncomfortable proximity to each other without producing a conclusion. She was extraordinarily skilled at being seen without being known. She built that skill deliberately, over many years, in response to conditions that made it necessary. And then she entered a world that required exactly that skill and rewarded it with a level of visibility that made the skill's original purpose, protection, impossible to achieve. The thing she was best at became the thing that most exposed her. She was 33 years old. She had been married for less than 3 years. The professional life that gave her the clearest sense of herself had been set aside. The family she married into had not fully absorbed her. The city she had navigated with skill and pleasure for a decade had become a place she moved through defensively. The life she was living in the summer of 1999 was, by any careful accounting, not the life she had built toward. What she wanted, in any private interior sense, is not something the record answers. The people who might answer it have chosen not to. The silence that defined her in life has followed her beyond it, maintained now not by her own discipline, but by the people who loved her and have decided that what they know belongs to them. There is a photograph. There is always a photograph in which she is standing at a window. The building is not identified. The year is unclear. She is looking outward at something outside the frame, and her expression is entirely unreadable. Not unhappy, not content. Present in the way that people are present when they are also simultaneously somewhere else entirely. The window is between her and whatever she is looking at. It is not clear which side she would rather be on.